There was a time when the world felt stable, predictable, and under control, a time when people believed that progress would solve everything, that technology would bring peace, that knowledge would eliminate confusion, and that the future would always be better than the past. But something has changed, and even if it is not always obvious, it is something you can feel beneath the surface, something quiet yet persistent, a sense that things are no longer moving in the same direction as before. Because when you step back and observe what is happening today, patterns begin to appear, patterns that are not loud but difficult to ignore, patterns that raise questions many people are starting to ask without even realizing why they feel the need to ask them. Why does everything feel faster, yet more empty? Why do people have more access, more comfort, more opportunity, yet feel less satisfied? And why does connection exist everywhere while loneliness continues to grow? And this is where things begin to shift from simple observation into deeper reflection, because these are not random changes, they point to something unfolding, something that is not sudden but gradual, something that builds quietly until it reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. And this is where the idea of the end times begins to enter the conversation, not as fear but as awareness, because long before this moment, there were descriptions of a time when people would live differently, think differently, and experience life in a way that would feel both advanced and unstable at the same time. What makes this powerful is not just that these descriptions exist, but how closely they resemble what we see today, because the most noticeable changes are not only in systems or technology, but in people themselves, in how they feel, how they think, and how they relate to one another. A person today can have everything they once dreamed of, yet still feel something missing, something that cannot be explained by what they have or what they lack. And this emptiness is not always visible, it hides behind success, behind constant activity, behind the appearance of having everything under control. And alongside this internal emptiness, there is also external confusion, a world where information is everywhere yet clarity feels rare, where everyone can speak but truth becomes harder to recognize, and where noise often replaces understanding. This creates a kind of instability that is not always obvious but is deeply felt, a sense that everything is moving, yet not necessarily in the right direction, and this is where awareness becomes essential, because without it, a person can be surrounded by signs and still fail to recognize them. And this is how people drift, not suddenly but gradually, step by step, without realizing it, continuing forward while something within them begins to disconnect. And this is exactly why reminders exist, not to create fear but to create clarity, to help a person pause, reflect, and understand what is happening before it becomes too late to question it. Because the idea of the end times is often misunderstood as something distant or extreme, but in reality, it is also about recognizing patterns in the present, understanding what is unfolding now, and becoming aware of the direction things are moving in. And when you begin to see it this way, it stops being just a concept and becomes a lens, a way of seeing the world with more depth and awareness. And this is where everything begins, not with a dramatic event, but with a realization that what you are seeing is not random, that what you are feeling is not imagined, and that something is changing in a way that deserves attention. Because the question is not whether these changes are happening, the question is whether you are paying attention to them, because the signs are not always obvious, but once you begin to notice them, once you begin to connect them, it becomes impossible to ignore them again. And that is where the shift begins, because awareness changes how you see, and how you see changes how you live, and that is the beginning of everything. And once this awareness begins to take shape, once you start to look at the world not just as it appears but as something that may be unfolding according to a deeper pattern, the next question naturally begins to form, not whether something is changing, but what exactly is changing and why it feels so familiar to descriptions that were given long ago. Because when you begin to compare what is happening today with what was once described, certain connections start to become clear, not forced, not exaggerated, but quietly aligning in a way that is difficult to ignore. One of the most striking patterns is the way time itself feels different, because despite having more tools, more systems, and more efficiency than ever before, people constantly feel that there is less time, that days pass faster, that weeks disappear without being noticed, and that life itself feels compressed, as if everything is accelerating without pause. And this is not only a feeling, it is something many people across different places and lifestyles are experiencing at the same time, which raises a deeper question about whether this is simply perception or something more meaningful. At the same time, there is a visible shift in values, where what once required effort now seeks shortcuts, where patience is replaced by immediacy, and where depth is often sacrificed for speed, creating a culture where people want results without process and recognition without substance. And while this may appear as progress on the surface, it often leads to something else beneath it, a loss of meaning, a sense that things are becoming easier yet less fulfilling, faster yet less valuable. And alongside this, another pattern becomes visible, the way truth itself becomes harder to hold on to, not because it disappears, but because it becomes surrounded by so much noise that distinguishing it requires more effort than ever before. Information spreads instantly, opinions multiply endlessly, and certainty becomes rare, creating an environment where confusion is not accidental but constant, where people are not only searching for answers but struggling to trust what they find. And this is where the connection becomes deeper, because these are not isolated changes, they are part of a larger shift, a shift in how people think, how they feel, and how they relate to what is real. And this is exactly the kind of transformation that was described as a sign, not of progress alone, but of imbalance, of a world moving forward externally while losing something internally. And perhaps one of the clearest examples of this is the growing sense of emptiness that exists even in the presence of abundance, because people today can achieve what previous generations could only imagine, yet still feel a lack that cannot be explained by material conditions. And this is not limited to a specific place or group, it is widespread, appearing in different forms but carrying the same essence, a feeling that something essential is missing. And this is where the story becomes more personal, because it is no longer about observing the world from a distance, it is about recognizing these patterns within your own experience, within the way you see things, within the way you respond to life, and within the way you define what truly matters. Because the signs are not only around you, they are also within the way you perceive and interpret what is happening. And this is why awareness is not just about knowledge, it is about recognition, the ability to see patterns for what they are, without exaggeration, without denial, but with clarity, because when you recognize something for what it is, it changes how you respond to it. It shifts your focus, it adjusts your priorities, and it makes you more intentional in the way you move forward. And this is where another important realization begins to form, because if these changes are not random, if they are part of a larger pattern, then ignoring them does not make them disappear, it only delays your understanding of them. And this is where many people fall into a passive state, continuing with their routines, adapting to changes without questioning them, and slowly becoming part of a pattern they do not fully recognize. But awareness interrupts that pattern, it creates a pause, a moment where you step back and ask not only what is happening but what it means and where it is leading. And this is where the concept of signs becomes powerful, because a sign is not something that forces you, it is something that invites you to reflect, to look deeper, and to understand beyond the surface. And when you begin to look at the world through that lens, through the lens of signs rather than coincidence, something changes, because you begin to notice connections that were always there but never fully recognized. You begin to see patterns not as isolated events but as part of a larger picture, and this gives you a different kind of clarity, not certainty about every detail but awareness of direction. And direction is what matters, because even if you do not know exactly what will happen next, understanding the direction in which things are moving allows you to respond differently, to think differently, and to make choices that are not based only on the moment, but on a deeper understanding of what is unfolding. And this is where the story continues to unfold, because once you recognize that these patterns exist, once you begin to connect what you see with what was described, the question is no longer whether it is real, but what you are going to do with that awareness, because awareness without action changes nothing, but awareness that leads to reflection, to adjustment, and to intentional living can change everything. And this is where the meaning of these signs becomes clear, not as something distant or abstract, but as something that directly affects how you live, how you think, and how you choose your path, because in the end, the purpose of recognizing signs is not simply to observe them, it is to understand them, and through that understanding to become more aware of what truly matters before it is too late to recognize it. And as this awareness begins to deepen further, the perspective starts to shift from simply observing patterns in the world to understanding what they reveal about the direction of human behavior itself, because the changes that are happening are not only external but internal, shaping the way people think, decide, and respond to reality. When you look closely, it becomes clear that one of the most significant shifts is not in what people have, but in how they value what they have, because meaning is slowly being replaced by convenience, and depth is being replaced by speed, creating a world where everything is available but very little feels truly fulfilling. And this shift is not always obvious at first, because it hides behind progress, behind innovation, behind the idea that everything is improving, yet beneath that surface something begins to weaken, something that once held people grounded, something that once gave clarity to what matters and what does not. As this grounding fades, people begin to rely more on what is immediate rather than what is meaningful, more on what feels good in the moment rather than what remains valuable over time, and this creates a cycle where satisfaction becomes temporary and the search for something more becomes constant. At the same time, another pattern begins to emerge, the way distractions become more powerful than focus, because attention is constantly pulled in different directions, making it harder for a person to pause, reflect, and think deeply about anything for a sustained period of time. And when reflection decreases, awareness weakens, and when awareness weakens, it becomes easier to follow what is common rather than what is correct, to accept what is popular rather than what is true. And this is where the connection to deeper signs becomes clearer, because a world that loses its ability to reflect is a world that becomes easier to influence, easier to redirect, and easier to shape without resistance. And this does not always happen in a dramatic way. It happens gradually, through small shifts, through habits that seem harmless, through changes that feel normal until they become the new standard. And as this continues, another transformation takes place. The way relationships themselves begin to change, because connection becomes more frequent but less meaningful, communication becomes faster but less sincere, and presence becomes more rare even when people are constantly interacting. This creates a paradox where people are surrounded by others yet feel increasingly alone, and this loneliness is not always visible, but it is deeply felt, shaping how people see themselves and how they relate to the world around them. And when all of these patterns are placed together, something becomes clear, not as a conclusion but as a realization, that these are not isolated changes but parts of a larger movement, a movement that shifts attention away from what is lasting toward what is temporary, away from what is real toward what is perceived, and away from what requires effort toward what offers immediacy. And this is where the importance of awareness becomes even more critical, because without it, a person can move through these changes without ever questioning them, adapting to them without realizing what is being lost in the process, and slowly becoming part of a system that feels normal but is quietly reshaping their priorities. And this is why recognition matters, because once you begin to see these patterns for what they are, you gain the ability to step back, to evaluate, and to decide consciously rather than react automatically. And this is where control begins, not control over the world but control over yourself, over how you respond, over what you accept, and over what you choose to prioritize. And this is where the deeper meaning of these signs begins to unfold, because they are not only indicators of change, they are opportunities for awareness, moments that allow you to recognize what is happening before it fully takes hold, and to adjust your direction while there is still time to do so. And as you reflect on this, as you connect these patterns to your own experiences, something begins to settle within you, something that changes how you interpret what is happening around you, because you begin to see that not everything that appears as progress leads to growth, and not everything that feels normal is necessarily right. And this realization does not create fear, it creates clarity, because it allows you to move forward with intention, with awareness, and with a sense of direction that is not defined by what is common but by what is true. And this is where the real shift begins, not in the world around you but in how you navigate it, because once you see clearly, you no longer move blindly, and once you understand the direction of change, you are no longer carried by it without choice. And that is where this part of the story leads, not to an ending but to a deeper level of awareness, where what you recognize begins to shape what you become, and where the patterns you observe begin to influence the path you choose to follow moving forward. And as this awareness continues to mature, the perspective shifts even further, because it is no longer only about recognizing patterns or understanding change, it becomes about responsibility, about what you choose to do with what you now see and how that awareness begins to shape your decisions in a world that is constantly pulling in different directions. Because recognizing signs without responding to them does not create change, it only creates a moment of clarity that can easily fade if it is not followed by intention. And this is where the real difference begins to appear, because not everyone who sees will act, not everyone who understands will adjust, and not everyone who feels the shift will choose to respond to it in a meaningful way. And this is why awareness alone is not enough. It must lead to reflection, and reflection must lead to action, because without that connection, everything returns to routine, and the patterns that were once noticed begin to blend back into normal life. And this is where one of the most important challenges emerges, the challenge of consistency, because it is not difficult to feel something in a moment, it is not difficult to recognize truth when it is presented clearly, but it is much more difficult to carry that awareness into everyday decisions, into habits, into the way a person chooses to live when there is no immediate reminder in front of them. And this is where many people begin to drift again, not because they rejected what they understood, but because they did not maintain it, they allowed it to fade, to lose its urgency, to become something they once felt rather than something they continue to act upon. And this is how awareness loses its impact, not suddenly but gradually as it becomes less present in daily life. And this is why intention becomes essential, because intention keeps awareness alive, it transforms understanding into direction, and it gives purpose to the choices you make even when no one else sees them. And this is where control becomes meaningful, not control over outcomes but control over yourself, over your responses, over your priorities, and over the direction you choose despite the influences around you. Because the reality is that the world will continue to move in its own way, distractions will continue to grow, confusion will continue to exist, and external conditions will not always align with what is right or meaningful. And if your direction depends only on what is happening around you, then it will always be unstable, always shifting, always influenced by forces beyond your control. And this is why grounding becomes necessary, because without something stable to hold on to, a person becomes reactive rather than intentional, moving from one influence to another without a clear sense of direction. And this is where the importance of internal clarity becomes clear, because it allows you to remain steady even when everything around you is changing. And this clarity is not something that appears instantly, it is built over time, through reflection, through awareness, and through consistent effort to align your actions with what you know to be true. And this process is not always easy because it requires discipline, it requires honesty, and it requires the willingness to choose what is right even when it is not convenient. And this is where the deeper meaning of responsibility appears, because once you recognize what is happening, once you understand the patterns, you are no longer moving without awareness, you are choosing, whether consciously or unconsciously, and that choice defines your direction more than any external condition ever could. And this is why every small decision matters, because direction is not defined by one moment, it is defined by repeated choices, by what you prioritize consistently, by what you return to when faced with uncertainty, and by what you hold on to when everything else feels unstable. And as this becomes clear, something shifts within you, because you begin to realize that the purpose of recognizing these signs was never just to observe them, but to respond to them, to allow them to guide you toward a more intentional way of living, a way that is not controlled by trends, distractions, or temporary influences, but by something deeper and more stable. And this is where strength begins to take a different form, not as control over others or over circumstances, but as control over yourself, over your ability to remain consistent, to stay aligned, and to continue moving in the right direction even when it is difficult. And this is what separates awareness from transformation, because awareness shows you what is happening, but transformation changes how you respond to it, and that response is what ultimately shapes who you become over time. And as you reflect on this, as you begin to connect what you see with how you live, something begins to settle, a sense that what matters most is not the speed at which the world is changing, but the direction in which you are moving within it. And that is where this part of the story leads, not to a conclusion but to a choice that exists in every moment, in every decision, in every response, where you either move with awareness or drift without it, and over time that choice becomes your path. And as everything begins to come together, as the patterns, the awareness, and the responsibility all align into one understanding, the focus shifts from what is happening in the world to what is happening within you, because at this point it is no longer only about recognizing the signs, it becomes about what those signs reveal about your own direction and the foundation on which your life is built. Because no matter how much the world changes, no matter how uncertain things become, the one thing that remains within your control is how you respond, how you choose, and what you decide to build your life around. And this is where the final realization begins to settle, not as something complicated, but as something clear and steady, that a person who moves without direction will always feel lost no matter how much progress they appear to make, and that a person who builds on something unstable will always feel uncertain no matter how secure things seem on the surface. Because everything external can shift, everything can change, everything can disappear in a moment, but what you rely on internally is what determines whether you remain steady or begin to fall apart when those changes come. And this is the deeper meaning behind everything that has been unfolding, because the signs are not only about what is happening around you, they are also about what is being revealed within you, about what you prioritize, what you trust, and what you turn to when things become unclear. And this is where many people realize that they have been moving without truly questioning their direction, following patterns, adapting to changes, and reacting to circumstances without fully understanding where it is all leading. And this realization does not come with noise, it comes quietly, as a moment of clarity where everything begins to make sense in a different way, where you begin to see that what once felt normal may not have been right, and that what once felt important may not have been meaningful. And this is where the opportunity appears, not to go back but to realign, to adjust your direction, and to choose with awareness instead of habit. And this choice is what defines everything, because it is not made once, it is made repeatedly, in small moments, in daily decisions, in situations where no one else sees what you choose, and this is where your true direction is formed, not in what you say but in what you consistently do. And this is what gives meaning to awareness, because awareness without change remains incomplete, but awareness that leads to intentional action becomes transformation. And this is where the idea of the end times takes on a different meaning, not as something distant or abstract, but as something that invites reflection, something that reminds you that time is not endless, that opportunities are not permanent, and that the moment you are in right now carries more weight than you may realize. Because every moment is a chance to choose differently, to move with intention, and to align yourself with what truly matters before that moment passes. And this does not require perfection, it requires direction, it requires the willingness to continue, to adjust, and to stay aware even when it is difficult, because the goal is not to become flawless, but to remain conscious, to remain intentional, and to keep moving in a way that reflects what you know to be true. And this is where everything becomes simple, not easy but clear, because the question is no longer about what is happening in the world, it is about what you are doing within it, how you are responding, and what you are becoming as a result of the choices you make. And this clarity brings a kind of stability that does not depend on circumstances, a sense of direction that does not change with trends, and a level of awareness that allows you to move forward without being lost in everything that is happening around you. And as this understanding settles, something changes, not outside but inside, because you are no longer moving without awareness, you are no longer reacting without reflection, and you are no longer drifting without direction. Instead, you are choosing consciously, intentionally, and with an understanding that what you do now shapes what comes next. And that is where the story leads, not to an ending but to a point of decision, a point where everything you have seen and understood begins to take form in your actions, because in the end, the difference between recognizing the signs and being changed by them is what you choose to do next, and that choice is always in front of you, in every moment, waiting to be made.